fantastic book over the last couple of weeks, and I thought I might see if I could catch up with John Wood for a chat this evening. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
And I want to thank Jane Seaton also for organising tonight's conversation, and welcome everybody who's joined us. John Wood, as you well know, is one of the most recognisable and loved faces in Australian TV, but his acting career, which spans 50 years, has actually been as strong on stage and as rich on stage as it has been on screen. His newly published memoir, which I just showed you, How I Clawed My Way to the Middle, is really a thoroughly enjoyable insight, not only into John's formative years, but also his determination to be in theatre and I guess the realities of being a working actor. It's just so lovely to be talking to you. I used to watch you on telly with my grandparents years ago.
Yeah, your grandparents are probably the average age of my groupies.
6 feet under now, unfortunately, but
yeah. What's the average age of groupies?
I want to ask you about how your days are going at the moment. You're in extreme lockdown and you've just published a book. What's going on for you?
Yeah, well, the book, you know, thankfully, I finished it, you know, I only finished it a few weeks ago, and I started writing it last year. I was asked if I would do it, and I thought I'd never intended to write a book, and anyway, my agent cajoled me into giving her a piece on I think it's chapter 3 or something in the book. I gave her that and she passed it on to someone at Penguin, and Penguin commissioned the memoir. So, which I didn't ever really want to write as a straight narrative. I just wanted to dip in and out, and I'm not quite sure how it's turned out. I actually haven't taken any notice really of the book except for the photographs. So, you know, but...
Did you find it challenging to write?
Oh, very. You know, like in the early stages of it, I kept getting bored with the subject. You know, I know that sounds ridiculous, but I thought there's nothing about me that is all that interesting or any different to anybody else of my generation. I went in a slightly different direction to most people, but the growing up part of it and just being an Australian kid, working class boy, was typical of a tremendous amount of the population of my generation, and you know, and I thought, what could possibly be interesting to anyone about this? So, but people have responded to it really brilliantly. You know, like It's amazing. People actually think this is a good book. Think, okay, great.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the sense that you're talking about the fact that it's something that you saw your childhood as being, you know, so much like everybody else's. That's why it's so relatable.
I suppose so. Yeah, I suppose so. But you know, thank God for the book. Thank God for Penguin. You know, like if I was working on it, and the last thing I was doing was a play called Crunch Time by David Williamson at the Ensemble Theatre in Kirribilli in Sydney, and we were closed down a couple of weeks early because of COVID, and we didn't do the planned tour to Noosa, which is where David Williamson lives, and I came home, and that was it. That was the last time I worked, the last time I saw another actor, had any contact with another theatre person, and as I say, thank God for Penguin and the book, because it gave me something to do. I actually managed to finish it, and now it's in the bookstores, which is it's an amazing thing to see, something that you've done sitting on shelves, you know, piles of them in bookshops. It's
and it's a great looking cover too, so it does look good on the shelf. But I think it was quite amazing to get to the end of the book and see just how recently you had concluded it by talking about the fact that COVID had shut down Crunch Time. And there's actually a photograph, the photograph of you guys on stage performing Crunch Time in amongst the last photographs. So I would love to hear you talk about that, because I know that I guess, poo-pooed the idea that it was David Williamson's last play because he said he said that before.
Yes, he
but
had.
it was pretty grueling for you, wasn't it? Isn't it, the character that you played and the
Well,
experience
he
you had on
was, yes.
stage?
It was much harder than I thought it would be. For those of you who don't know, the play is about a guy who's a successful businessman with a wife and 2 sons and 2 daughter-in-laws, and he's fairly brusque and cold and incredibly wealthy, and he suddenly finds out that he's got a terminal illness and makes the decision that he wants to finish when he feels like finishing, and puts the sons in charge of getting hold of the drugs to do it, and then expecting them to administer the injection because he doesn't know that he could actually do it himself. And I must say, the first time we rehearsed it in the dressing room, in the rehearsal room, it's virtually impossible to describe, but I actually felt like I was allowing myself to be killed, because you try and find a character within yourself and then try and express the character through what you do as an actor. And, I can't put on a character from the outside. My understanding is that Geoffrey Rush, first finds the aftershave. I could never do that, like the aftershave would be meaningless to me as a, and look, and I'm not sure, that might be an urban myth about Geoffrey, because I worked with him for 2 years, and I do remember him using aftershave, but I don't remember him finding a character in the aftershave. But I can't put it on a character from externally. It all has to come from within, and it's those characters that you find. I mean, for example, Tom Croydon, I would never have Tom Croydon's courage or ability to do the things that he did. I'm a basic coward, I think, and I played a character named Lambert LaRue in a show called Pravda in South Australia once, a long time ago, and he was based on. The character was somebody who was a newspaper proprietor who was trying to take over Fleet Street. So I guess you can imagine fairly easily who it was based on. And he was very cold and very domineering and treated people appallingly. And reaching into myself and finding that I had the ability to do that was quite confronting. Like I thought, God, I'll never be able to get that level of coldness, and to find that I actually could and that I had it within me was fairly devastating. And it's one of those things, that has reminded me yet again, I've always believed it, is that you have to leave the character at the stage door. You can't carry them around in the street. So, hence I've never made any citizens' arrests, because I'm not a real policeman. So.
What? You're not a real policeman? I am interested in how you do achieve that, leaving the character at the stage door, though, because is that a conscious process that you go through?
Yes, I very much try to become myself again. The minute I leave the stage, like the character no longer exists. I mean, there have been times when it's been a bit more difficult than that, but the character no longer exists. I mean, there would be people in the industry who say, I never have a character anyway, it's always just you. And I mean, I don't
But like Tom Cruise.
Well, I don't know. I don't know Tom Cruise's work very well, but I do try and find a character, although, you've got nothing, that's the hardest thing about being an actor, is that you've only got your own body and voice. You can put on funny voices and false noses and all that sort of stuff, but I don't think that's honest, really, in a way. Anyway, look, everybody works in a different way, and I certainly can't do it from the externals or coming from outside. It has to come from within, and so far it's worked all right. I might never have to do it again the way things are going.
No, you definitely will. We'll get to that bit later on. I was thinking about, when I was re-looking at certain chunks of the book today, about there's a whole section about when you had shingles and you had like 13 weeks of isolation, and I thought, you're prepared for this thing you're going through right now. You've been there before.
Yes, many times. Shingles was an extraordinary experience. It was one of the things I think that encouraged me as an actor, I guess, because I was at home for 13 weeks and all I could do was sit in bed and or sit on the sofa and watch daytime television. And they were the days when daytime television had midday movies, and they played all those wonderful golden years of Hollywood style movies. And I learned a lot from watching people like Spencer Tracy and James Stewart and the Marx Brothers and various other people. I really loved watching those movies, but I was totally inactive. I had it in my left arm, I think. Yeah, left arm. I was going to say right arm, but that's because my right arm's a bit sore for some reason. But it was, there were all those old wives' tales. And of course, my mother would say, it starts there and it goes right around your back. And if it meets again in the middle, you die. That was, I thought, oh God, and that was a well-known story, for anybody that had anything to do with shingles then. I don't know if it's true. Thankfully, they never met again in the middle, so I didn't.
Thank goodness for all of us.
Yeah. Well,
tell me about your mum and dad. I think it's always, when you've gone somewhere in your life and people know you and respect your work, it's always nice to pay respect to where you came from in the first place. And you do that beautifully in the book, in kind of acknowledging, where, the situation that your parents found themselves in and how hard they worked to support you and your siblings. And tell us a little bit more about them.
Well, they were, the thing I discovered when I was writing the book was how much I miss them. Not something that I expected. When I was a kid, I spent most of my time out of the house. I spent as much time as possible around at friends' places and managed to get myself invited to their place for dinner because their mothers were much better cooks than mine. And the food was just so much more interesting. But Mum was a Port Melbourne girl, and she was taken out of school at the age of 11 when she was in 5th grade, I think. And her mother died when she was 11 of cancer. And of course, my mother had a terrified fear of cancer for the rest of her life, although she died quite peacefully of natural causes. But she always had that spectre of cancer hanging over her. But she was a working class girl. Her father was a stevedore, or painter and docker, as they're probably more widely known these days, and but a labourer, and her family was a labouring family, and she was taken out of school. Her brothers were at South Melbourne Tech, I think, and she was taken out of school to run the house. When her mother died at the age of 11, she became chief cook and bottle washer and bed maker and all that, and which must have been a shocking experience for an 11-year-old. It must have been ghastly. And the great pity is that of the whole family, I mean, the brothers were both quite interesting. Her older brother was an amateur photographer who's sort of semi-professional photographer. So he had a bit of an artistic flair. Her other brother, I'm not sure about, but he was killed in the Second World War in the Pacific in a place called Tarakan, and of the three of them, she was the one that really needed to stay at school and deserved to stay at school. But of course, she was a girl, and we all know what girls are good for. They're good for staying home and cooking. And but she was the one that would have really benefited from an education, I think. And she was extraordinary. She was in her middle years, and she was a dreadful cook. There's no doubt about it. But then, teaching yourself
Did she admit
at the age of 11, you can understand why she was bad. But Mum would sit in a little tub chair in the living room, knitting, reading a book and watching telly and taking part in every conversation that was happening in the room and sticking her oar into everything. And, I think her catchphrase would have been "silly bugger."
It's a familiar one, yeah.
Watching Graham Kennedy, stupid bugger. And then she'd go back to her knitting and her reading. But she used to get, half a dozen to a dozen books a week out of the library. The local library in Ringwood at the time was called the Brown Study, and she would take her books in religiously, swap them over, get a whole new lot, and at least 10 a week, and she would read them voraciously. And she was a big movie fan. She was the one who really turned me on to those golden years of Hollywood and all those stars. And she and a couple of her workmates, whom we knew as aunties, Auntie Nell and Auntie Josie, they used to meet up probably once a month, I suppose. We'd get the bus to Ringwood, and then we'd get a train to to the city, and then another bus to Port Melbourne to Auntie Nell's place. And of course, they all had their favourite film stars. Auntie Nell was mad about Clark Gable. Mum was Jimmy Stewart, my boy, Jimmy, my boy. Oh. And I can't remember who Auntie Josie liked. I think it might have been somebody like Bogart or Spencer Tracy, but I can't remember now. And they would discuss the issues of the world and the issues of Hollywood. And so I became really interested in that sort of acting. I think I learnt a lot from Spencer Tracy, the way he worked. I don't know if I did, but, I feel like I did. I would have loved to have been a tough guy like Humphrey Bogart, but that was never going to be the case. I thought he was phenomenal, and a really terrific actor, a much better actor than people thought he was.
What did your mum think of your your aspirations to be an actor?
I don't know where they came from, as it happens. I've got no idea. I've got a feeling that she took us once to the Tivoli, and I don't remember it, but I remember it was a dance show, but that's all I remember. And it was, a huge theatre with all the bells and whistles and lights. And after that, I started having recurring nightmares, this music would start and everything would go black, and then the lights would come up on a gold lame curtain, which would either rise or separate, and then something really dreadful would be enacted upon the stage, and I would wake up screaming. And this happened night after night after night, and I got to the point where I could wake myself up as soon as I heard the music. And I think Vincent Price's voice was involved in it somewhere along the line. But anyway, that was my introduction to the theatre. But I think Mum had a, I think she accepted it very early on, like they came to see a play that I did when I was working for Melbourne Youth Theatre. When I was working, we were an amateur company, and Max Gillies directed me in a play called A. And it was a very funny English comedy, and the role was originally played by David Warner in the UK, and subsequently he became a bit of a favourite actor, and particularly I thought he was phenomenal in Wallander as Wallander's father, the mad painter. But like my parents came to see it, of course. They were very supportive, even though Dad didn't have the faintest idea of any of it. And Mum actually said, I think you better be prepared for the fact that your big son might become an actor. And that was the first, that was the first time anybody had expressed it. I had no idea that I really wanted to be an actor. It's all I wanted to do, but that sort of solidified it, I think, set it in concrete. And Dad's only comment was, one day I was walking out of the house to go to the outside dunny, and Dad was at the back door with a bucket of water doing something or other, watering his dahlias or something, and that's the only thing he's ever said about it. And he didn't actually look at me; he just sort of a cigarette hanging out off his lip, and I don't know what you want to do that bloody acting for. It's a bloody sissy sport. And I made no comment, and I just continued on my way to the dunny, and he never ever mentioned it again.
Amazing.
That was his opinion. But I heard many years later, my mother-in-law said that he'd confessed an interest in being an actor himself when he was young. And God knows where that would have come from, because he lived on the Murray River in, far away Swan Hill, and how it would have ever occurred to them anybody could become an actor, I have no idea, because it was there I was 40 years later, and I had no idea how to become an actor, and nobody I knew had any idea of how you go about it, despite the fact that I was working in amateur companies. I say working, it's always been work. I've always looked on it as work, as a job, but it's never been mucking around or playing a game. It's always been work. And but as I say, nobody had the faintest idea. Even one of my teachers at school, John Ellis, who'd done some amateur acting in the city, he had no idea how to go about it. And he, along with his wife Lois Ellis, formed a company called Melbourne Youth Theatre, which was open to people under the age of 26. And he rang me when I was working at the railways. I don't know how he got my number, but he rang me, and he'd just come back from the UK, and he said he was going to form this company, he and Lois, and would I be involved? Would I like to be involved? Because I'd formed a drama group with him at school, and it was such a relief to know that somebody wanted me to do something of that sort. And we did that for a couple of years, and, as I said, I did the show with Max, and one day Lois Ellis came up to me with a piece of paper, and she said, I think you should apply for this. It had become very clear to her that nothing was going to stop me from pursuing a career, and it was an application form to go to NIDA, which that was the first I'd ever heard of NIDA, and she'd been there herself. She was in the first intake back in 1961. I went in 1967, and, I read the form, and you had to have leaving. And because of the shingles, I'd never gotten around to getting my leaving. I'd been sick for a whole term, and never even finished year 11. And I thought, well, this is a waste of time, but I'll apply anyway. And I applied and was asked to do an audition, which I did at Russell Street Theatre with only one person in the audience. That was Tom Brown, and he was the director of NIDA at the time. And it seemed to go okay. The audition went well until he said, "Can you sing?" And I said, "Well, yes." He said, "Well, sing something." And I thought, oh, God. And I must have known a million Beatles songs at the time, or Rolling Stones songs, but I couldn't think of anything at all except the Defendant's song from Trial by Jury, which we'd done back in fourth form at the tech school. And so I sang that. And, I'd always been very self-conscious about the song because it always seemed very twee to me. The refrain of it was tinker-tank, 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 and what the hell did that mean, I did it anyway and got in.
He offered you a scholarship.
Despite the fact that I didn't have a leaving certificate and despite the fact that I didn't have any money, and I was given a $6 a fortnight scholarship and consequently went. And here I am today. And somebody asked me the other night how I would go auditioning for NIDA now, and I don't think I'd have the talent to get in. I see young people today at various drama schools all over the country, and they're just so much better than I was. And if I went along armed with the audition piece that I did and singing Tinker Tank, I would be just laughed off the stage, I think.
You had some great contemporaries at NIDA too, didn't you? The one that really stood out for me was Robin Nevin.
Well, she wasn't a contemporary of mine. She was a contemporary of Lois Ellis's. Oh. She'd been there in the years before. In fact, I didn't meet Robin until several years later, I think probably about 1970. But funnily enough, she and her daughter Emily, Robin's marriage had split up, and they came and lived in, we had a funny little terrace house in Randwick that backed onto a bush gully, and it had an attic room, and Robin and her daughter Emily came and lived there for about a year, I think.
It would have been fun to sit around that kitchen table.
Well, I don't know. I can't remember anything, but and Robin doesn't remember much about it either. She typed up the manuscript on a big old Underwood typewriter of a play that I wrote called On Your Marks, and but she said, when I mentioned it to her not so long ago, she said, "No, I didn't." I thought, it doesn't matter.
So, I mean, I'm interested in it. Actually, there's a few roles that I really want to ask you about. And one of them I think West Australians will be interested in was your role as Alan Bond in The Challenge. And I love the story. Well, you tell us, because it was quite an interesting collection of stories about meeting Eileen and then spotting Alan in a cafe in the city one day.
Oh, yeah. Gosh. I thought, it was a great story, and I remember the late night win and, and seeing live to air Bob Hawke in his funny jacket saying anybody that sacks a worker today is a bum. And and then a couple of years later, we went to Sydney, and we were in South Australia at the time. I was working with Jim Sharman and Neil Armfield and various other people in the Lighthouse Company, and we took a couple of shows to Sydney, and on the strength of that, I was, producers in Sydney started casting me and stuff, and one of the things that I got was playing Alan Bond in The Challenge. And as I said, it was a great story, and, the stuff about the winged keel and all that, it was really interesting to do. But I never met Alan. I never ever met him, not once. And Lorraine Bailey and I were in Fremantle or Perth or somewhere over in the West, and we were on a wharf, and Eileen arrived in a black Mercedes sports car with leopard skin upholstery. Big Red, she was known as at the time, and she was really a very nice woman. I got the impression with a similar, very similar sort of upbringing to mine, you know, working class, and she certainly had a very working class accent. And but as I said, we never met Alan, and we made the show, and you know, like towards the end of the gig, Alan started getting into a lot of strife financially, and you know, like, and he was clearly ripping people off unmercifully, particularly in the West, but you know, worldwide he was, you know, fleecing people of their money, and he. I remember saying at the time that I was playing him, you know, despite the fact that he had a Cockney accent. I said, I'm playing him as a little Aussie hero, but there's going to come a time if I ever play him again, I'm going to have to play him as a little Aussie crook. Mm. And funnily enough, that came about. I can never remember the name of the series, but it was, you know, I actually played him after, you know, like
again
on trial. And I remember being really angry one night. I was watching the late news, and they had a sequence on him. He was helming a yacht off the south coast of England, and the reporter said to him, "You must have very fond memories of the Americas, you know, winning the Americas." He said, "Oh yes, wonderful memories. It all comes back, you know." And I thought, "You bastard! You went into court and claimed you had absolutely no memory of anything." But yeah, he was a bit of a bastard.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly got the impression in the bit of the story that you tell about how you spotted him in a cafe and you kind of locked eyes.
Yeah, that was in King Street, I think. Is that the street that runs down towards the Mad?
His Majesty's, yeah.
Yeah. And I was, you know, we were doing a show there. I was over there with John Frost's organisation doing How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, with Tom Burlinson and an amazing cast of people, Noel Ferrier, June Bronhill, Bruce Spence. And I was sitting at a table by myself in this restaurant. I can't remember the name of it, in King Street. And I looked up and I noticed that Alan Bond was at a table just across from me. And he had four younger people, you know, they were all in their 20s and 30s. And he was sitting there having a meal, and they were all on mobile phones, you know, talking away. And, you know, and he looked so lonely. I couldn't believe how lonely he was, you know, because nobody was talking to him. And I looked, you know, and he looked over and he caught my eye. I've got no idea if he knew who I was or that I'd played him on telly. This was before all the trials, but he sort of looked at me and just looked away, went back to his meal. But
it's a funny moment, though, isn't it? Given, I mean, it's a funny moment to remember, given that you had to inhabit his character for, you know, for the duration of that series.
Yeah. It was funny because I never ever met him. We got an invitation to go to the Bond marquee at the Melbourne Cup, and I'd never been to the Melbourne Cup before, and so we went along and went to the marquee. Julie turned up, Leslie, my wife, and Lorraine Bailey went together, and neither Eileen nor Alan were there. We were entertained by their son John, who seemed like a nice enough sort of a guy, and but Alan, I believe, was sitting with Jeff Kennett up in the grandstand. Probably, you know, who knows where, but he wasn't in the marquee. Yeah. So I never ever met him. And then the next time I had anything to do with him, I was playing him as a little Aussie crook.
Yeah. I'm interested when you talk about, for example, that amazing cast that you were working on with How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And it's something that you comment on in the book about how you form these incredible bonds with actors when you're actually working on a play or working on a series. And then sometimes those bonds are irrevocably broken for the rest of your life. But you've been so tight with them, and then all of a sudden it's not there anymore. I wanted to hear you talk about that a bit more.
Well, it's, you know, I used a a quote from the wonderful Lillian Hellman at the beginning of the book, and you sort of work with each other in an amazing proximity. You become an absolute family of people, and you all create these characters and interrelate with each other, interact with each other, and the show comes to an end, and it's always really sad. That's, you know, like it's unbelievably sad when it all comes to an end and you've all got to move on, and you move on swearing undying love and that you'll see each other soon and blah blah blah, and sometimes you never ever see some of those people again. You know, and that's a great example. I don't think I've ever run into Tom Burlinson since. He had a girlfriend in the show who became his wife, and she was from the same part of town as I was. Croydon obviously turned out some interesting people. There was me, and Magda Zabansky came from Croydon,
oh, right.
and this young dancer was from Croydon as well. And now her name, and I hope she forgives me, but her name's gone. But, you know, like, as I said, I've never run into Tom in any other situation. And I've never run into Mandy, the girl he married. I've never run into her again. I think once I've run into her. Noel Ferrier, of course, died not long after the show finished. And he was preceded by June Bronhill, whom I've never seen, who I never saw again. And I saw Bruce Spence a couple of times. I did a series with Bruce called Dearest Enemy. He played my best mate. I was married to, I was a communist writer married to a member of the Liberal Party government, and played by Lyndon Wilkinson, who's still a great mate. But I haven't seen Bruce for years, you know, like, but I've been a huge admirer of him since Pram Factory days, you know, like, he's a terrific actor, and yeah, but you know, it just happens, you know, like you're separated. You become this family, and then you break up into, you know, and then you meet up with another group of people and become another family doing another show, and you go through the same process of learning to like each other and work with each other, and you know, you build this amazing structure and perform for an audience that loves you or hates you, and then you finish and it's really sad and you break up swearing undying love and never see each other again.
I want to ask you about casting as well, because I know that the way in which you ended up being cast as Michael Rafferty was just such a lucky kind of story about how that all came together. And I think it's quite instructive about how just being in the right time, being in the right place at the right time can really affect your chances in the industry.
It's all about luck, really, you know. I mean, perseverance and luck, you know. A young actor needs to be very patient and have a lot of perseverance and needs a lot of luck on their side, you know. It's but the story of Rafferty was it was created by a guy named Ben Lewin. He created the character, and the series was set up by a guy named Howard Griffiths, and Howard became the head of drama at Channel 7. And Channel 7 had never had a drama department before, and Howard became the head of drama, and he'd been chief story editor and script editor for the ABC drama department in Melbourne, where I'd worked on Power Without Glory and several other shows, and I got to know him quite well. And he actually asked me if I would be interested in auditioning for this Rafferty character, and I read the script and loved it. And I said to him, look, Howard, I've just signed a contract to play Menzies in The Last Bastion and I can't. There's no way I can do this. I'll be off shooting this other telly movie, and I can't. So I didn't even audition, and they shot a pilot directed by Ben Lewin with Chris Hayward as Rafferty, and the Fulvio character, I don't know if he was named Fulvio, was played by an actor named Mark Little, who at the end of that went off to the UK and became quite famous on the radio there. And I finished The Last Bastion, and I got a phone call from Howard, and he said, "We're having trouble editing the pilot. We can't get it to sit together, and we're going to reshoot it, and we're going to recast it and reshoot it." And I said, "Well, what's wrong? Why not use Chris?" And he said, "Well, he's not available. He's doing something else." And for any young actors out there, you know, if you commit to something, the expectation is that you will do it, you know, which is why I did The Last Bastion instead of the pilot for Rafferty's Rules, because I'd made the commitment. I'd said yes, and the expectation is that you'll keep your word. And anyway, Chris was committed to something else, and he couldn't do it. And I went and auditioned, and probably every other actor my age in the country auditioned for it as well. I know for sure that Graham Blundell auditioned for it. And, you know, Graham had he had great success in film, you know, with Alvin Purple and things like that. And anyway, I got the role, despite the fact that my hair was still Menzies hair.
Menzies-like.
They dyed it. And, you know, so the top of my head became sort of a light gingery colour, and around here where my hair was dyed white, as for Menzies, it was sort of bright orange. And if you ever see the pilot, I still look like I've got Menzies hair on underneath my own.
That was an interesting experience for you, in the sense that it was, I guess you got your first experience of the sacrifices of being a full-time actor working in a TV series, because while it was great to have that role, and you said that you found it really groundbreaking work, that you also had to leave your family behind in Melbourne for 5 years. Yeah, well,
we just spent, you know, like prior to being offered Rafferty's, or The Last Bastion, The Last Bastion, I only had to be away for brief amounts of time. But when I was offered Rafferty's, it was obviously going to be a 12-month contract. And we'd previously all gone to Adelaide together when the girls were quite young. You know, they were still in primary school. And the primary school that they went to when we were in Adelaide was just we lived on a 50-acre farm out near Stirling in the hills out of Adelaide, and at the bottom of the drive and just across the road was Heathfield Primary School, and they went there. So that was, they had a great couple of years doing that, but Leslie wouldn't, I think she was perfectly justified in not doing it. She didn't want to take them out of school again, and
yeah.
I think they probably would have turned out fine, but, but I agreed, that they should stay in Melbourne and go back to the school that they'd started at Ferny Creek, and Meg was just about to go into secondary school. And so it was decided that the family would stay here in Melbourne, and I went up there. And in those days, of course, airfares were pretty expensive, and and despite what people believe about actors, you don't make that much money. You don't get scads of money that you can actually afford to be spending, $600 a week on airfares to go home at the weekend. And so I had a contract that said that they would fly me home, when it was convenient, every couple of months. And so that was the way it turned out. That's the way it worked. But as I also say in the book, if I had the chance over again, I certainly would have knocked it back.
Yeah, that's a really big thing to say, isn't it? Because it was a good gig.
It was a great gig, yes, and and as I say, groundbreaking. It was the most interesting series that we'd ever made up to that point, and probably, I'd have to say there's not much that's been made that comes close to it in terms of its sense of irony and comedy and reality. It's something like Rake has similarities, I think, and Sea Change, of course, which is just our story in reverse. The magistrate goes down to the country rather than coming down to the city, and but there's been precious little else that's been of that calibre, I think, in Australian TV, and I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And, the cast was extraordinary. There was myself and Simon Chilvers, whom I'd worked with at the Melbourne Theatre Company, Catherine Wilkin, whom I'd worked with at the Melbourne Theatre Company, and Kate was a New Zealander, and Simon was a Pom, and Archie Michael was a Greek Cypriot from St Albans. And Archie was, Archie just won the hearts of Australia. They just adored Fulvio. And, I think the show had a style that sort of started with the writer, in a way, with Ben Lewin, who is, was of course Jewish. And so there was a sense of, an underlying sense of Jewish humour through it, and self-deprecation and all that sort of stuff. And the four leading actors, myself, Simon, Kate and Archie, were all theatre actors. So the performances, compared to most television that was around at the time, were very big. They were big theatrical performances. And the scripts sort of helped us to do that. The scripts demanded that we be, some sense of heightened comic reality that, most shows eschew with, they just poo-poo that sort of stuff. You've got to, you've got to have a profile and don't move your lips,
there's more wit in it. It's actually interesting. One of the things that I would like to know about the experience of doing Rafferty's Rules and then doing Blue Heelers afterwards was a sense of when you realised that your life had changed in just going out into the street and being somebody that people recognised on a regular basis.
It's funny. I sort of, I can't, I wear the mask down the street, because we've got to over here, and I wear the mask, and people say, "Oh, hi, John, hey." I couldn't possibly rob a bank. I wouldn't be able to disguise myself enough to rob a bank. But sorry, I've forgotten the question.
Well, what did you
becoming famous? Yeah, it was an interesting development. It was not something I'd expected, really. I didn't, I don't think anybody goes into the business to become famous. That's not the first thought in any young actor's mind. It's not the fame, and if it's the money, then they should disabuse themselves of that very quickly, because the money just doesn't exist unless you get to Hollywood. The level of recognition was unbelievable. People just got so used to seeing you, and and after that was five or 6 years, Rafferty's. And then a few years later, we started on Blue Heelers, and that was 12 years of people seeing you in the corner of their living room, and so you became a part of their furniture in a sense, and so familiar to them. I remember standing outside a sandwich shop one day in Manly or somewhere. It was while we were doing Rafferty's. I don't know whether we were actually on location or not, but I was standing outside prevaricating, as I usually do, about which sandwich bar to go into, which one looks the best, which one, you know, which is the better value, all that sort of stuff. And I can never make up my mind in that situation. And I was just sort of standing there, and there was a dress shop or something just next door to one of these things, and a woman just came out and took me by the arm and started walking off with me. And I didn't say anything for a moment. I would have said something fairly soon, but she just suddenly realised that I wasn't her husband, and he was on the other side of the shop. And but she just come out, and I was so familiar to her that she just took me out by the arm and started walking off.
Yeah, there's someone I know.
Yeah, and it's understandable because you are in their house. You're actually a fixture in their house for several hours a week sometimes. And
but is it a strange thing that people talk to you as if they know you when you don't know them from a bar of soap?
It is strange, but it's understandable. You know, I do understand it, and I don't. I mean, some people refuse to engage. You know, some famous people refuse to engage, and I can't do that because these people have invested a lot of their life in what you do. You know, they've actually done you the honour of watching you on telly, and you know, and they've basically paid you wages for the entire time you've been there. The thing that I learned when I was doing Rafferty, it was I don't know who broke the news to me, but as I say, I take myself very seriously, and I try, you know, it's work that you have to be conscientious about. And so I was doing Rafferty's, and it suddenly was explained to me that Rafferty's wasn't important. What was important were the commercial breaks, you know, and the show was only to attract an audience to watch the commercials because the commercials paid for the show. And to realise what you were doing is absolutely of no interest to the network. They're only interested in selling advertising. And, you know, the content is, if the content sells advertising, you're their best friend. And if the content doesn't sell advertising for them, forget it, go away.
Well, that kind of leads me to, I know you're going to get asked this in every single interview that you do, but after being nominated for 9 consecutive Logies, the timing of your actual win just before Blue Healers was canned gave you this moment on the stage that is probably not the moment it would have been in any of the preceding years. But will you tell us about that moment, your acceptance speech for the Gold Logies, and what was going on for you at that time?
Well, you know, I was at a point, you know, like I never expected to win it, you know, not in any of the previous 9 years, and certainly not in the 10th year. You know, my view at the time was that if I didn't win it then, I would never win it. That would be it, because a couple of radio stations got fully behind me in the way that Tom Gleeson did behind Grant Denyer. You know, you know, there were T-shirts made by one radio network, and I was talking to her the other day. She lives in Perth now. Her name's Michelle something or other, and they came up with the old Don Smallgoods logo, and they made a picture of me with the logo, "Is John is good."
Brilliant.
And they, you know, look, and people like that were really, in the end, responsible for me winning. And I remember, you know, like speaking to a young guy, I don't know whether it was the year I won or the year before, but he said, "I just wanted to tell you that I voted for you 51 times. You know, like, so they get the TV week and fill in the coupon and send it in. He voted for me 51 times. And I thought, gee, that's very generous of you. And he said, "Yeah, I voted for Lisa McKeown 63 times. I thought, oh, you know, how rigged is this voting system? It's
So rigged.
yeah. So I never had much faith in whether it was a worthwhile award to win. But I was quite proud of the fact that for 10 years in a row, I was one of the 5 most popular people on Australian television for 10 years in a row. That was probably quite extraordinary, I think. I don't know if it was a world record. Bert Newton said he was, nominated for many years more than me. But, it was nice just to be nominated. And Steve Vizard, of course, after the award had been presented and won and presented, Steve said, "I would have been much better if you hadn't won. It would have been a much better story."
Yeah, that's exactly Vizard's sense of humour.
Yeah, exactly. But look, it was lovely to win it. And you were asking about the speech. The producers tried to get the network to agree to extend the show so they could tie up a lot of loose ends and stuff like that. There was a whole lot of unfinished business in terms of Tom's life and PJ and William's character, and even with the death of Maggie, we'd never really fully explored that, I don't think. And I know that Lisa didn't want the character killed off. She just wanted to move on as an actor and do other things. And it was decided to kill her in the most brutal way imaginable. And it was... so there are a whole lot of things that the producers just wanted to finish off for an audience, and the network didn't agree. The network, decided to finish it, and... which is fair enough. It's their choice, their money, and that's fine. But I was making the speech with the gold logie in my fist, and I said something like, the first thing I said was stolen from Sheila Florence. Oh, so much, so soon. After 10 years of nominations. But then I want to say, it had been a great honour to do the show, and that I was really sorry that the network had withdrawn its support. And as I said that, I realised I was looking straight at David Leckie, who was at that time the network managing director or whatever, and he looked absolutely ropeable, as though he would have killed me if he'd been able to get near me. And I didn't understand why, because the network had withdrawn its support, no question about it. They decided to go in another direction, and and that's fair enough. That's their money and it's their decision, and I had no problems. It would have been nice to have finished the show properly for the audience, but that wasn't to be. And, and the reason it ended, and, and it needs to be said, is because they'd committed such huge sums of money to the AFL. They'd signed a contract for 2 years' worth of football for $790 million. Now, for that money, they could have done Blue Healers for 75 years. But they've spent it on the footy. Now, I'm a big footy fan, and I don't care. They get paid much more than I do, unfortunately, and that's the reason it was stopped. My brother, who's a scientist, worked out that it was about $2,000 a kick. So.
Incredible.
It's huge money, and the money is even bigger now. It's 1.2 billion or something now. I don't even know the details because it doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. But I remember that figure because it directly cost me my job.
John, I could talk to you for another 2 hours, but our time is almost up. I just want to ask you one final question, which is about the title of the book and why you called it How I Clawed My Way to the Middle.
Because it's a funny line. I think it's
funny.
It's you know, and there's a lot of irony about it, you know, like and I mean, it's not meant to be self-deprecating or anything. It's just, I think it's a very funny line that a friend of mine named Ron Challoner once said to me that if he ever wrote an autobiography, he'd call it How I Pulled My Way to the Middle. And I thought, that's great. And, you know, hopefully I have his permission to use it well, you know. But, you know, like I honestly think in a real sense, and I think I say so in the book, you know, I don't think I got much further than the middle. You know, like if I did get any further, it wasn't very far. And, you know, getting to the top, you know, we've still got, there's still, you know, and I hope I'm not adding to it, but there's still a cultural cringe in Australia. And, you know, when I started out, the cultural cringe was enormous.
Yeah.
It's not so big now, but it's still there. And I sort of, you know, like I became about as famous as you could become in Australia as an actor. And, but I realised that, you know, that you know, if I wanted to get to the top, there was still a lot of rungs on the ladder to climb to either go to the UK and make it in the West End or go to Hollywood and become famous like Jeffrey. But, you know, I had no, you know, most people who graduated from NIDA went around the time that I did, went to the UK to try and make it in the UK. And I knew a few people who'd gone and come back. And I've met, in my career, I've met a lot of people who've been and come back. And some of them came back with very posh English accents. And, you know, like I didn't want to have an English accent. I wanted, you know, if I had anything at all to say, I wanted to say it to the people who lived in Croydon, you know, who were my contemporaries back then. You know, I had an Australian voice and I wanted to use it. And I just happened to come into the business at the same time as people like Jack Hibbard and Alex Buzo, John Romerill, David Williamson were starting to write plays. Up until that time, the only two plays that really had ever been performed that were written by Australians were The One Day of the Year by Alan Seymour and Summer of the 17th Doll by Ray Lawler. And a musical called Ballad of Angels Alley had a bit of success, but up until then, no Australian play had ever, or the story of the Handsome Cab, I think, was an Australian story. But, you know, I just happened to, again, be in the right place, for me, the right place at the right time. A place where the Australian voice was starting to be legitimate in the Australian theatre.
Mm. John, I know that you've got another Zoom call to back with this one, so I'm going to let you go, but I really took from the book how much dedication you've given to your craft over the time and how much it's meant to you to do a beautiful job of everything that you've stepped up to over the years. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have had the chance to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to talk to you. I hope it was informative for our audience.
Yes, I hope so too. And I will just remind our audience that next Tuesday evening, I'm going to be talking to English novelist David Mitchell about his new book, Utopia Avenue. So I hope you can join us for that. But thank you so much, John Wood, and all the best for the journey of How I Clawed My Way to the Middle.
Thank you very much.
See you later.
I have to leave now. Okay.
Yes, you have to leave.
Bye-bye.